The sun hung low over Fort Richardson, casting long shadows across the parade grounds. It was late September, and the evening air carried the crisp smell of pine trees mixed with the faint sounds of drill instructors shouting in the distance. The military academy sat nestled in the foothills of Colorado, a place where young men came to learn discipline, leadership, and the meaning of duty. Commander Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her truck, her weathered hands gripping the steering wheel one last time before she released it. She was in her mid-40s, with blonde hair pulled back into a neat bun and sharp blue eyes that had seen things most people only read about in books. Her face was lined, not from age alone, but from years of stress, sacrifice, and decisions that had changed lives. She wore a plain gray jacket over her military uniform, nothing fancy, nothing that announced who she was or what she had accomplished. Sarah grabbed her duffel bag from the truck bed and headed toward the administration building. She had been assigned here for 6 months, a training position that she thought would be straightforward. She would help develop the curriculum for the senior cadets, teach them about real-world operations, and share some of the lessons she had learned during 2 decades of service. It seemed like a good fit, a chance to give back while taking a step back from the field. What she did not know was that her reputation had not arrived with her. Inside the academy, in the senior cadet barracks, 4 young men were gathered in one of the rooms, talking and laughing about the new instructor who was supposed to start that evening. News traveled fast in a place like Fort Richardson, and the cadets had already heard the rumors. "Another civilian consultant," said Brad Harrison, a tall cadet with a square jaw and the kind of confidence that came from never having faced real failure. "My father told me they're bringing in some woman to talk about leadership, probably never spent a day in combat." The other 3 cadets laughed. There was Marcus, broad-shouldered and athletic, with the kind of smile that made him popular with the other students. Then came David, quieter than the others but no less arrogant, and finally James, the youngest of the group, who looked up to the others like they were already generals. "A woman," Marcus repeated, shaking his head. "How is she going to teach us anything about military operations? This academy is about real training, not some feel-good seminar." Brad leaned back in his chair, his boots up on the desk in front of him. "I heard she was some kind of administrator in the Navy, probably pushed papers for 20 years. My dad said they're just filling a quota. We shouldn't take her seriously." None of them knew that Brad's father, General Thomas Harrison, had actually met Sarah once, years ago, at a classified briefing. He had never mentioned her name to his son, and he would never have imagined that Brad would be one of her students. Even if he had known, Brad probably would have dismissed it. Brad had a way of dismissing things that didn't fit into his view of how the world should work. Sarah found the dormitory and checked in with the front desk officer, a young lieutenant who seemed nervous and kept glancing at his watch. She was given a small room near the senior cadet barracks, a practical choice for someone who would be working closely with that group. The room was sparse, a bed, a desk, a chair, and a single window that looked out over the training grounds. Sarah set her duffel bag down and sat on the edge of the bed. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the last few years, 203 missions. She had lost count after the 200th. Some had been successful, some had required difficult choices, and some had cost her things she could never get back. There was a reason she had asked for this assignment. She needed time to think about who she was when she wasn't chasing targets in the dark, when she wasn't making life-and-death decisions with a few seconds' notice. She needed to remember what it felt like to be someone other than a weapon. She unpacked her few belongings, some clothes, a photograph of her younger sister, and a small journal where she had written down thoughts she could never share with anyone else. On the desk, she set her military credentials, a nameplate that said Commander Sarah Mitchell, United States Navy, Special Operations Command. It was simple and official, with no indication of the extraordinary things written in her classified file. Down the hall, Brad Harrison was still talking. "I'm going to ask her a tough question on the first day," he said, smiling. "Just to see how she handles it, we need to know if she's worth listening to." "What if she is?" James asked quietly, the youngest one already showing signs of doubt. "She won't be," Brad said with absolute certainty. "A woman like that, she's here because they need to check a box. She's not here because she earned it." Marcus nodded in agreement, and David said nothing, which was worse than agreement. His silence meant he didn't care enough to disagree. What none of them knew was that Sarah Mitchell had earned everything she had, 1,000 times over. She had earned her way into a world that very few people ever saw, where the rules were different and the stakes were real. She had made decisions that changed the course of events in places that most Americans could not find on a map. She had lost friends and teammates, and she carried the weight of those losses every single day. But she did not wear that on her sleeve. She did not need to announce it or defend it. She simply knew who she was, and that would have to be enough. The next morning, Sarah walked to the classroom where her first session would take place. She carried a single folder and wore her uniform, neat and pressed but not decorated with anything beyond the basic medals that came with a career in the Navy. She had learned long ago that real credibility was not won through display. The cadets were already sitting at their desks when she arrived. Brad was in the back row, his arms crossed, his expression skeptical. Marcus sat beside him with a slight smirk. David was in the middle and James was in the front, the only one who looked even remotely open to what she might have to say. Sarah set her folder on the desk and looked at them for a moment without speaking. Her eyes were calm but sharp, the eyes of someone who had looked into darkness and looked back. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady and quiet. "I'm Commander Sarah Mitchell. I'll be working with you for the next 6 months. Before we start, I want to be clear about something." She paused, letting the silence settle. "I know some of you probably think I'm not qualified to be here. I know some of you don't think a woman belongs in a role like this. That's fair. You're entitled to your opinion." She smiled slightly. "But here's the thing. My opinion is the only one that matters right now. I'm here to teach you and you're here to learn. If you decide not to take that seriously, that's your choice. But I promise you'll regret it." There was something in the way she said it that made even Brad sit up a little straighter. "Now let's begin," Sarah said, opening her folder. What she did not tell them was that in 2 days, she would learn about a problem in the academy that nobody else had noticed. She did not know that her quiet presence would eventually force a confrontation that would shake the entire institution. She did not know that these 4 young men would become the catalyst for a revelation that would change everything. All she knew was that she was here to do a job, and she was going to do it well. The question was whether they would ever realize who they were really dealing with. For the first 2 weeks, Sarah simply observed. She taught her classes on leadership, decision-making, and crisis management, drawing from her own experience but keeping the details vague. She could see the skepticism in Brad's eyes gradually soften into something more like curiosity. Marcus stopped smirking. David remained neutral, and James began to ask genuine questions. But something else was happening that had nothing to do with the classroom. Sarah had always been trained to notice things, small inconsistencies, patterns that didn't fit, the little signs that indicated larger problems. It was a skill that had saved her life more than once in the field. Now, living in the dormitory near the senior cadets, she began to notice things about the academy that troubled her. She heard the laughing in the late hours, and sometimes, underneath it, something that sounded like crying. She saw bruises on younger cadets that didn't match the official explanations. She noticed certain students suddenly changed their schedules or avoided certain parts of the campus. The details were small, but they added up. One evening, as she was walking back to her room, she encountered a junior cadet sitting alone on a bench outside the dormitory. The young man, who couldn't have been more than 18, had his head down. His uniform was disheveled, and when he looked up at the sound of her footsteps, she saw the fear in his eyes. "Good evening, sir," he said quickly, standing to salute. "I was just taking a break." Sarah studied him carefully. "What's your name?" "Cadet Robert Torres, ma'am." "Torres, you look like you've had a hard day." The young man hesitated. For a moment, it seemed like he might tell her something, but then he closed down, pulling back into that careful, official manner that military people use when they don't want to show weakness. "I'm fine, ma'am, just tired." Sarah did not push him. She had learned long ago that sometimes people needed to come to you on their own. Pushing too hard only made them defensive. But she filed the encounter away in her mind, adding it to the other small pieces she had noticed. That night she sat in her room with her journal and began to write down everything she had observed. Over the past 2 weeks, she had documented 7 incidents. 7 separate occasions where she had seen evidence of something systematic, something organized, something intentional. It was not the kind of thing that left obvious marks, which is why nobody else had noticed it. But Sarah had spent 2 decades in special operations, and she knew exactly what organized, systematic intimidation looked like. The next morning, she requested a meeting with the Academy's commanding officer, Colonel James Richardson. His office was in the main administrative building, and Sarah sat across from him at his large oak desk, watching his expression shift as she explained what she had observed. "With respect, Commander," Colonel Richardson said, his voice careful, "we run a tight ship here. The cadets are rough on each other, but that's part of the training, building resilience." "I'm not talking about rough training," Sarah said quietly. "I'm talking about hazing, organized intimidation, psychological abuse." "That's a serious accusation." "I'm not making an accusation," Sarah replied. "I'm reporting an observation. There's a difference." The colonel leaned back in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. "Even if what you're saying is true, which I doubt, these are military cadets. They're tough. They're supposed to be tough. If something illegal was happening, someone would report it." Sarah did not argue. She had heard this before, in different places and different ways. There was always a reason why people did not want to look too closely at what was happening in their organization. There was always a justification for why the uncomfortable truth could be ignored. "I understand your position, sir," she said, standing to leave. "I wanted you to be aware of what I've observed." "Of course," the colonel said, clearly relieved that the conversation was over. "I'll keep an eye out, but I wouldn't worry too much. Everything here is well under control." It was not under control, and Sarah knew it. But she also knew that Colonel Richardson was not going to help her. That meant she would have to do this on her own. Over the next week, Sarah began her real investigation. She did it carefully, never pushing too hard, never asking questions that seemed like she was digging. She talked to cadets casually, in passing. She listened to conversations in the dining hall. She made mental notes of who seemed comfortable and who seemed anxious. She was building a picture, piece by piece, of exactly what was happening. By the third week, she had enough information to know that Brad Harrison, Marcus, David, and 3 other senior cadets were leading a systematic hazing operation targeting the younger students. It was not just physical intimidation. It was psychological, designed to break down confidence, enforce a strict hierarchy, and maintain control through fear. The realization bothered Sarah more than she wanted to admit. Brad Harrison was not a bad person, not fundamentally. He was a young man who had been taught by his family and his environment that power was something to be exercised, that hierarchy was something to be enforced, that weakness was something to be eliminated in others. She had known people like that. She had worked with them. Some of them had learned, others never did. Sarah made a decision. She was going to teach Brad Harrison a lesson, and she was going to do it in a way that would change how he understood power, strength, and what it really meant to be a leader. On Friday afternoon, she sent a message to the senior cadets. She wanted them to meet her for an advanced training session on Saturday morning. It was voluntary, she said, but she recommended they attend. It would be worth their while. Brad received the message with curiosity. Sarah Mitchell had not asked to see him specifically. She had not accused him of anything. As far as Brad knew, she might not have suspected a thing. So why the meeting? When Brad mentioned it to the others, Marcus laughed. "Maybe she wants to give us her leadership talk. It'll be boring, but we should probably show up. Might look good on our records." Brad agreed, but he had a strange feeling in his stomach. The kind of feeling he got sometimes when he knew he was about to face something he did not understand. That night, Sarah sat in her room and prepared for the next day. She knew exactly what she was going to do. It was not going to be a simple demonstration of strength. It was going to be something far more effective, a revelation that would force these young men to look at themselves and see what they had become. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. Brad Harrison walked across the parade grounds toward the training facility where Sarah had told them to meet. Marcus walked beside him, and David and James followed behind, along with the 2 other senior cadets who had been involved in the hazing. The training facility was a large, open building used for physical drills and simulations. Inside, Sarah stood alone, wearing not her classroom clothes but her full combat training gear, the kind of outfit that told you she was not here to give a lecture. "Good morning," she said as they filed in. "I asked you here because I want to do something different today. I want to teach you about real leadership. And the only way I can do that is by showing you what leadership looks like when it's not about control or fear. It's about something else entirely." Brad shifted his weight, suddenly uncertain. There was something in Sarah's demeanor that had changed from the classroom. She seemed different, more solid somehow, more real. "What we're going to do," Sarah continued, is a scenario-based exercise. I'm going to put you in a situation and you're going to have to respond. The goal is to see how you make decisions under pressure. Are you with me?" They nodded, some more enthusiastically than others. Sarah activated a video on a large screen behind her. It showed a simulation of a hostage rescue scenario, the kind of thing they had studied in textbooks but never really experienced. A group of civilians trapped in a building with limited intel about the location of the hostages. A rescue team with limited resources. A time limit. "You have 20 minutes to develop a plan," Sarah said. "Work together, discuss options, make decisions as a team. I'm going to observe and then we'll talk about what you did." For the first 15 minutes, it was clear who was in control. Brad took charge, making quick decisions, assigning roles, moving through the scenario with confidence. He was good at it, actually, smart, tactical, willing to take risks. But Sarah noticed something else. The other cadets were not contributing. They were simply following his lead, waiting for him to tell them what to do. When the exercise ended, Sarah asked them to sit down. "Tell me what you think went well," she said. "We developed a solid plan," Brad answered quickly. "We minimized casualties and got the hostages out." "You did," Sarah agreed. "And tell me who came up with the plan." "I did," Brad said, and there was pride in his voice. "The rest of the team followed my lead." "Right," Sarah said, "and that's the problem." She let that sit for a moment, watching confusion spread across their faces. "Real leadership," she continued, "is not about being the smartest person in the room. It's not about being the strongest or the most confident. Real leadership is about bringing out the best in the people around you. It's about listening. It's about making people feel like their contributions matter. It's about building people up instead of tearing them down." She walked closer to them, her voice growing quieter but somehow more intense. "You know what I've noticed since I got here? I've noticed that some of you are very good at making other people feel small. I've noticed that you use your position, your strength, your confidence to control people who are younger and less experienced than you. And I've watched some of you," she looked directly at Brad and Marcus, "tolerate it without saying anything, which is just as bad as doing it yourself." The room went very quiet. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said. "Tomorrow morning, there's going to be a review. The Academy Command is going to interview the younger cadets about their experience here. They're going to ask specific questions about whether anyone has been treated unfairly, and I suspect they're going to find some very interesting answers." Brad's face went pale. Marcus stood up. "You can't prove anything. Nothing illegal happened. It was just standard training." "Sit down," Sarah said, and her voice was like ice. Marcus sat. "Standard training," Sarah continued, "does not involve telling a young man that he's worthless if he can't do 50 push-ups. Standard training does not involve locking someone in a bathroom and telling them you'll let them out when they apologize for being weak. Standard training does not involve organizing other cadets to exclude someone socially until they break down crying." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "I have documentation of at least 8 separate incidents of psychological abuse carried out by this group. I have statements from cadets who are willing to discuss what happened. I have observation logs dating back 2 weeks, and all of it will be presented tomorrow morning." David, who had been quiet the entire time, finally spoke. "What do you want us to do?" Sarah looked at him, and something in her expression softened slightly. "I want you to take responsibility. I want you to understand what you've done and why it was wrong, and I want you to help fix it." "If we confess," David said slowly, "we'll be expelled, we'll lose everything. Our military records will be destroyed." "That's possible," Sarah agreed. "Or you can come forward, you can express genuine remorse, you can commit to making changes, and you can work with the Academy to implement new oversight systems to prevent this from happening again. That path is harder, and it requires real change. But it's the only path that doesn't make you terrible people." Brad stood up. For a moment, it seemed like he might argue, might try to defend himself. But instead, he just looked at Sarah with something like shock. "You're not just new faculty, are you?" he said quietly. "No," Sarah replied, "I'm not." She did not elaborate. She did not tell him that she had led teams in 12 different countries, that she had trained elite operators in advanced tactics, that she had been responsible for the success or failure of operations that had shaped world events. She did not tell him that she had faced down armed enemies with more cause to kill her than Brad's insecurities gave him cause to bully younger cadets. She simply said, I'm someone who has spent a long time learning what real leadership looks like, and I'm offering you the chance to learn it too." That night, Brad lay in his bed and did not sleep. He thought about the times he had made someone else feel small to make himself feel big. He thought about Marcus's laughter at the expense of younger cadets who were just trying to find their place. He thought about David's silence, which had been consent. He thought about James's questions, which had been the beginning of doubt. And he thought about Sarah Mitchell, standing in that training facility with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen and done things he could barely imagine. By morning, his decision was made. The meeting with Colonel Richardson took place on Monday morning. Brad, Marcus, David, and James sat in chairs facing a panel of 3 officers, including the colonel and 2 investigators from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Brad spoke first. He detailed every incident, every cruel word, every intentional humiliation. He did not make excuses. He did not try to minimize what had happened. He simply told the truth. Marcus, watching Brad's honesty, felt something break inside him. His pride, maybe. His certainty that he could talk his way out of this. Slowly, he added his own account, filling in details that Brad had not mentioned. David and James followed, both of them clearly relieved to finally be able to tell the truth, to stop carrying the weight of what they had done. By the end of the meeting, 4 cadets had confessed to systematic hazing over a period of 6 months. 9 younger cadets came forward with their own stories, stories of isolation, of humiliation, of nights spent in fear. The revelation sent shockwaves through the academy. Colonel Richardson, embarrassed but professional, initiated a full investigation. He brought in outside reviewers to examine the culture at the facility. He suspended the senior cadets pending a disciplinary review, and though it clearly cost him, he sent a formal request to Sarah asking her to help develop new protocols to prevent similar situations in the future. Sarah agreed, not because she wanted to help the academy save face, but because she saw an opportunity to actually change things. She knew that punishing the cadets was necessary, but it was not sufficient. The system that had allowed this to happen had to be dismantled and rebuilt. Over the next few weeks, she worked with the Academy Command to implement new oversight systems. She created a confidential reporting mechanism for younger cadets who felt uncomfortable. She developed training programs for senior cadets focused on building them up as leaders rather than as enforcers. She required regular check-ins between instructors and students to identify problems before they became systemic. It was the kind of work that did not come with fanfare or recognition. It was the kind of work that was slow and frustrating, and sometimes seemed like it was not making a difference. But Sarah had learned long ago that this was where real change happened. Not in the dramatic moments, but in the quiet, persistent work of building something better. 2 weeks after the investigation began, Robert Torres, the young cadet Sarah had encountered on the bench that first night, requested a meeting with her. They sat in her small office in the training facility. Robert was nervous, his hands fidgeting with the brim of his hat. "I wanted to thank you," he said finally, "for everything, for noticing something was wrong, for doing something about it." Sarah smiled slightly. "You're welcome, but I want you to know something. What happened to you, none of that was your fault. You didn't do anything wrong, they did." Robert nodded, but she could see that the weight was still there, that it would take him time to fully believe that. "There's something else," Robert said. "I overheard some of the senior cadets talking after the meeting with the investigators. Brad Harrison was talking to Marcus about you, he said. He said he looked you up. On the internet and through some military database someone accessed for him." Sarah felt her stomach tighten slightly. She had always known that she could not hide forever. "What did he find?" she asked carefully. "He didn't say much," Robert continued. "He just kept shaking his head and saying, 'Oh my God, oh my God.' He told Marcus that you had been involved in more operations than he could count. He said the things you had done were classified, but the things that were public, they were incredible." Sarah set down her pen and folded her hands on her desk. "Did he seem upset?" "No, ma'am, he seemed humbled, I think. Like he finally understood that you were not just a faculty member, that you were someone who had actually earned your authority." After Robert left, Sarah sat alone in her office for a long time. She had not wanted the cadets to know who she was. She had wanted to teach them based on her ideas and her methods, not based on her credentials or her reputation. She had wanted them to learn that real leadership was not about impressive accomplishments. It was about respect, integrity, and the ability to bring out the best in others. But perhaps Brad learning the truth was not a bad thing. Perhaps he needed to understand that the person he had dismissed as just another instructor had lived a life that demanded respect. That evening, Brad requested a meeting with Sarah. When he arrived at her office, he looked different, smaller somehow, less certain of his place in the world. "Commander Mitchell," he said, saluting formally, "I wanted to speak with you privately." "Please sit down," Sarah said. Brad sat, clearly struggling with what to say. Finally, he spoke. "I apologize for my behavior, for the way I dismissed you when you first arrived, for not taking seriously what you were trying to teach us, and for what I did to the younger cadets." "I appreciate that," Sarah said. "But what matters now is not your apology to me. What matters is what you do from this point forward. You have a chance to become the kind of leader I was trying to teach you to be. The kind who lifts other people up instead of tearing them down. Are you going to take that chance?" "Yes, ma'am," Brad said. I don't know how to be different, but I want to try." Sarah regarded him for a moment. "Good, that's all anyone can do. Try, and be honest about the places where you fall short. The fact that you can see that now, that's the beginning of real growth." The final month of Sarah's assignment at Fort Richardson was marked by a series of formal reviews and disciplinary hearings. The Academy conducted a thorough investigation into what had happened, extending the scope beyond just the senior cadets to examine the broader culture that had allowed hazing to persist. It was revealed that Colonel Richardson had received 2 prior reports about suspicious behavior, but they had been dismissed without proper investigation. This failure, while not intentional, was systemic. Richardson accepted responsibility, and the Academy brought in new oversight officers with explicit authority to investigate student complaints. Brad, Marcus, David, and James appeared before a disciplinary board. The outcomes varied. James received a reprimand and was allowed to graduate with modifications to his record. David was given probation and required to complete intensive counseling on leadership ethics. Marcus, who had shown the least remorse during the initial stages, received a suspension and was required to repeat his final year. Brad's case was the most complex. In his final hearing, something unexpected happened. 8 of the 9 younger cadets who had been targeted by the hazing came forward voluntarily to speak, not to make excuses for what Brad had done, but to acknowledge the changes they had seen in him over the past month. They spoke about how he had taken genuine steps to help undo the damage, how he had been working with younger cadets to build them up rather than tear them down, how his understanding seemed to have fundamentally shifted. The disciplinary board took this into account. Brad was given probation and ordered to complete advanced leadership training with Sarah personally overseeing his progress. It was not the ending Brad might have wanted, but it was, in its way, a more difficult path, one that required him to genuinely change rather than simply accept a punishment and move on. On Sarah's last day at the academy, she held a final class with the senior cadets. The room was completely full. Word had spread about who she really was, and dozens of cadets had requested to attend, even though it was not required. Sarah stood in front of them, and unlike her first day, she did not look at them with careful neutrality. She looked at them with something like hope. "2 months ago," she began, "I was just another instructor as far as you were concerned. Some of you thought I had no business being here. Some of you did not take seriously what I was trying to teach. I understand why. When you have not seen the real world, when you have not been forced to examine the true nature of power and responsibility, it is easy to dismiss those lessons." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "I have spent the last 20 years doing things that few people ever do. I have led teams into situations where failure meant death. I have made decisions that affected thousands of lives. I have seen what happens when leadership is about ego and control instead of service and integrity." She looked directly at Brad. What happened in this academy? The hazing, the intimidation, the systematic tearing down of younger cadets. That is what happens when people with power use it without conscience. And the reason I could not allow it to continue is not because I am better than you or because I was sent here to fix you. I could not allow it to continue because I have seen what that world creates, and I know that it is not the world we want. She set down her notes and spoke from the heart. Real leadership is not measured in missions or in the things you accomplish. Real leadership is measured in the people you lift up. It is measured in the difference you make in someone else's life. It is measured in the ability to look at yourself honestly and change the parts that need changing. She smiled slightly. Some of you are going to go on to do extraordinary things. Some of you will serve with honor and distinction, but none of that will matter if you do not learn to lead with integrity. The world does not need more powerful people. It needs more people who use power with wisdom and compassion. As Sarah looked out at the sea of young faces, she saw something she had not seen on that first day. She saw recognition. She saw understanding. She saw the beginning of growth. After the class, Brad stayed behind. He had been working with Sarah for the past month, and it had changed him in visible ways. He was quieter now, more thoughtful. He listened more than he talked. He had started volunteering to tutor the younger cadets in classes where they were struggling, not to assert dominance but to actually help. "What will you do now?" Brad asked. "I'm going back to active duty," Sarah said. "There are situations that need my attention." "Will you come back?" Brad asked. Sarah considered the question. "Maybe, if the academy wants me to and if I think I can make a difference." "For what it's worth," Brad said, "you definitely made a difference. You changed how I see everything, about power, about leadership, about what it means to be a man." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "The hardest part of growing up is realizing that you were wrong. The second hardest part is actually changing because of it. You have done both. Keep going." A week later, Sarah packed her truck and left Fort Richardson. The academy had offered her a permanent position, which she declined politely. She had other work to do, other places where her experience was needed. But she left behind something that would last far longer than any single person: a culture of accountability, a system of protection for vulnerable cadets, and a group of young men who had learned that real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. 6 months later, Robert Torres graduated from the academy. In his final year, he had become one of the top students. His anxiety and fear had transformed into quiet confidence. He had made the decision to pursue advanced officer training, and he credited the changes in the academy's culture with making that possible. Brad Harrison also graduated. His transcript included both his disciplinary record and his letter of commendation for his work helping other cadets and for his demonstrated growth in leadership capability. When he received his commission as an officer in the United States Navy, he requested assignment to Special Operations Command. Years later, it would be said that he was the kind of officer who actually listened to his team, who valued their input, and who used his authority to protect those under his command rather than to control them. For Sarah Mitchell, the story of Fort Richardson became just another chapter in a long life of service. It was not the most dramatic chapter. There were no heroic firefights, no dramatic rescues. But in her own way, she knew it was one of the most important chapters she would ever write. Because she had learned long ago that the most important victories were not the ones that made the news. The most important victories were the quiet ones, the ones that changed people from the inside out, that took someone who was on the path to becoming a tyrant and redirected them toward becoming a leader. Years later, when people asked Brad Harrison where he had learned the most important lessons of his life, he always said the same thing. "From a woman I tried to dismiss because I did not understand who she was. She taught me that real strength is not about dominance. It is about building other people up. And once you learn that, everything changes."